Shalom and welcome to the Israel Policy Pod. I'm Neri Zilber, a journalist based in Tel Aviv and a policy advisor to Israel Policy Forum. As promised, we're back this week once again with Israel Policy Forum's Chief Policy Officer, Michael Koplow, and Shira Efron, IPF's Diane and Guilford Glazer Foundation Director of Policy Research. I wanted them both back on this week to discuss next week's U.S. election in the context of the debate on, yes, Israel policy, and to also go around the horn to discuss this past weekend's strike on Iran, UNRWA, as well as Lebanon and Gaza diplomacy. This was a great conversation, wide-ranging, and obviously very, very timely. Let's get to Michael and Shira. Hi, Michael. Hi, Shira. Welcome back to the podcast.
Hi, Neri. Hi, Shira.
Hi, Michael. Hi, Neri.
Hi to you both. Thank you both for coming on twice in 1 month. Not a given, but this, I feel, is a special moment in time after the high holidays here in Israel and, well, other places as well, and before the U.S. election next week. We'll get into U.S. politics later on in the podcast, but I really wanted you both on this week to talk about the other events happening a bit closer to my home, starting with the big news of this past weekend. Israel finally hit Iran. So after a few weeks of anticipation and speculation, early Saturday morning, Israel launched 3 waves of airstrikes against Iranian military targets in retaliation for that massive Iranian ballistic missile barrage earlier this month. Overall, I think it's fair to say it seemed to be quite a successful and impressive operation. 100 Israeli planes in the air involved in the strike. Iranian air defenses and missile production sites were hit and reportedly taken out. And the Netanyahu government didn't overdo it, didn't go too far, in my opinion. But Michael, I want to start with you. As a well-known Iran hawk, at least on this podcast, were you satisfied with the Israeli response? I know that coming out of April's back and forth between Israel and Iran, you had argued that Israel should have done more back then. What about now?
I am satisfied with the response. I think this is what they should have done in April. And I'm satisfied with it for a few reasons. First of all, by all accounts, they did real damage to Iran's ballistic missile and drone capabilities by attacking factories, by attacking fuel mixing sites. So they targeted the weapons that had targeted Israel, and I think that that's important. Second, as opposed to last time where they took out one S-300 battery, and that was allegedly sending a message that they can hit anything they want at any time and that would deter the Iranians. This time, again, based on what we know from media accounts, it seems as if they took out almost all, if not all, of Iran's S-300 batteries, which are its most advanced air defense systems. And what that does is hopefully actually create future deterrence by saying to the Iranians, if you respond to this, next time we can basically hit anything we want. I mean, this time Israel pretty much hit anything it wanted, but Iran is now exposed in an even greater way, and hopefully that will prevent any Iranian response, or at least any Iranian response that's meant to be a real response as opposed to something symbolic. And third, the Israeli government seems to have heeded the Biden administration's warnings about going too far. And going too far in this case would have been hitting nuclear sites and hitting large oil production sites. Although, again, based on some reporting over the last couple of days, it seems like maybe there are some sites that were hit that are tangentially involved in the energy industry. But the point is, they didn't go after these targets that would have absolutely created a bigger Iranian response and that would have risked an actual war between the two sides breaking out, and what that would mean for U.S. involvement and all the downstream complications, particularly ahead of a presidential election here. So I am definitely, for all these reasons, I'm satisfied with the response. And as opposed to last time, I am optimistic that this type of response will end this basic tit for tat. That doesn't mean that Israel and Iran won't be going after each other in various ways going forward. But I think that this particular exchange has a good chance of now being over, and everybody can take a step back and reassess what that means and how to deal with Iran going forward. And obviously, we're not out of the woods. I think that we've had a concern really over the last couple of months as Hezbollah was destroyed, that Iran would respond by going to nuclear breakout. And I still think that that's absolutely a danger. But the immediate risk of a larger war, I think, has been averted. And to my mind, that's a good thing.
Okay. A responsible and professional response send a strong message to Iran, and also sets up Israel quite well if the need arises for a future response if Iran hits back. I agree with all of that. Shira, what did you think of Saturday morning's very early events, Israel's strike on Iran, and what do you expect Iran to do or not do moving forward after Saturday's strike?
So, I agree with Michael, and I'm also pleased to see that, Israeli strikes were what we thought made sense, and obviously heeding to U.S. pressure, which was a positive in this case. We'll probably talk about the many other ways that Israel is not listening to the U.S. later on. However, I think it's not the end of the story, right? The Israeli response took some time, right? It was anticipated for a long time. Every day we thought it's going to happen now. And then on Saturday, it was so clear that it's happening early morning. Friday night here. But there is one assessment that says that Iran could very likely retaliate in the next few days before the U.S. elections. And that, depending on what this looks like, does it look like the previous response, which was quite substantial, right?
180 ballistic missiles.
Yeah, with not maybe as significant damages as it could be, but definitely damages. And Iranians also demonstrating that they can hit strategic sites, right? According to foreign press. Neri, your foreign press. So we can say that. But, in Israel, the censorship doesn't allow saying this, but strategic sites were hit. And if this happens, what will Israel do next? So I think we're definitely not out of my hope would be that Iran would contain this, and then we can close this chapter for at least for a while. And the assessments that I'm hearing today are that Iran is more likely to respond than not respond. And it could also be sooner than what we expect. And then I think it will be interesting to see what we do next. Because judging by the atmosphere here, it would be very hard for Israel to contain an Iranian retaliation.
Exactly. So very interesting. Look, they may very well respond. I was struck by the kind of more restrained rhetoric coming out of Iran since the weekend, essentially saying that Israel didn't hit anything, there was no damage, really downplaying the extent of the strike. I thought that was a good sign. But like you said, Shira, there are other signs pointing to the fact that they may actually retaliate for the retaliation, et cetera, et cetera. I was also struck by the fact that this seemed to be on the lower end of what we expected Israel to do on Saturday. So on this podcast, we've been talking about it for the last couple of weeks, that according to my information, it was very clear that Israel was going to strike military targets, including kind of in and around Tehran, and not nuclear or energy. And also Israel would make a major effort to avoid Iranian casualties, but I thought maybe they'd go for something a bit more high profile, shall we say, in kind of central Tehran or another big city to kind of show the Iranians in the world that they were being hit. Some of that did happen, but to my knowledge, I think a bit outside of Tehran. All in all, the Netanyahu government proved itself to, at least on this issue, right, Shira, to be quite restrained, and hopefully the cooler heads prevail in Tehran. That's what we can hope for, because absolutely there will be an Israeli response if Iran retaliates. We've heard that even before this weekend. We've heard it after the weekend from the prime minister to the defense minister to chief of staff Herzi Halevi, the IDF. Very clear that there will be an Israeli response. And I think some people here in Israel and DC would like nothing more than another crack at Iran to go after bigger targets and more high-profile targets.
Right, but this is where we go into, right, this is where the tension is. If we go back and, people that have analyzed Netanyahu's approach to Iran throughout the years said that his, wet dream since 2012 was to drag the U.S. into a war against Iran. And, this is going to be sort of, right, the escalation ladder. So the next, if Iran responds, then Israel's retaliation is likely going to be quicker, and it's going to be during the lame duck period. It'd be very difficult to contain it from further escalation. I mean, I know that's what the administration has prioritized, right? De-escalation, and preventing a regional war. From where I sit, it looks to me like we are in a regional war already, but preventing it from a full-blown war We're definitely not out of the woods.
So I wasn't going to get into it, but let's get into it. Michael, the election's next week. And then by definition, there's going to be a lame duck period and President Biden will still be president until end of January. What do you think the Biden administration will do, say, if Donald Trump wins on specifically the Iran issue? And then what do you think the Biden administration will do on the Iran issue if Kamala Harris wins? Obviously, he has a lot more options and a lot less political constraints during the lame duck period.
I'm not sure on the Iran issue anything changes, right? If we think about what President Biden's preferences are, his preferences are to avoid a regional war. I don't think that's because of the election. I think that's what he would like to avoid. And I also think that you still hear administration officials, as implausible to my mind as this is, speaking about in the next couple of months getting ceasefires in Gaza and Lebanon and moving forward with the Saudi normalization deal. I know that high-ranking Israeli government officials have been telling visiting Americans similar things, that they still think it's possible to get a Saudi normalization agreement before the end of the Biden presidency. And so if that's still your North Star, if you're President Biden and other White House officials, then it doesn't matter who wins the election. You still don't want there to be even more regional escalation. You want things to be quieter. So I don't think that if Donald Trump wins, for instance, Biden is going to say, all right, well, at this point, everything's going to be his problem. And so I'm going to greenlight an Israeli strike on Iran. I don't think that's what he's going to be looking for. And I don't think that's in the cards. I also think that the idea that during the transition, Israel has a freer hand. I understand that argument, but I also think that there are arguments that go the other way, irrespective of who wins. If Harris wins, then Netanyahu is going to have to be pretty careful about what he does during the transition, because he'll be facing a president that I think we would all agree is not the person that he wants. And so, he's going to have to be careful about what he does, and starting off on a bad foot with a President Harris. And if Trump wins, Israelis assume that Trump is going to just greenlight whatever they want to do on Iran. And I don't think that's correct for a whole variety of reasons, starting with the fact that when Trump was president, yes, he was hawkish on Iran in some ways, certainly with sanctions and certainly with killing Qasem Soleimani, but he did not authorize military action against Iran. He didn't go blow up the nuclear sites. He didn't tell the Israelis or enable the Israelis to go do that. And his rhetoric during this campaign has not been about going after Iran. And furthermore, JD Vance went on a podcast just, I think, on Monday, where he made this interesting comment about how pro-Israel Americans have been more militaristic than Israelis post-October 7th. And his explanation, his reading of this, was that Israelis got attacked by Hamas on October 7th. And so their natural response was to say, let's go after Hamas. But that pro-Israel Americans looked at that and said, oh, this is an excuse to go after everybody, including Iran and Russia. And Vance then said, it would be a huge mistake for the United States to get into a war with Iran. Why would we want to go to war with them? It would be costly and expensive and not in our interest. So granted, that's J.D. Vance, not Donald Trump, but I think that in some ways, J.D. Vance reflects the thinking of the MAGA-verse as much as, if not in some ways even better than Trump does. And so the idea that if Trump is going to be president on January 20th, that Israel can cause a giant mess in the region up until January 20th, and then Trump will come in and say, thank you for doing all these things. I don't think that's correct. So does any of this forestall the Israeli government doing stuff that I would consider to be dumb during the transition? No, of course not. We've seen the Israeli government do lots of dumb things. But I'm not sure that the politics of it in the U.S. are going to work out for them no matter which way the election goes.
Save your U.S. politics thoughts for later on. That's a good start, Michael. Very good start. And we should say, just on the Saudi deal, I've also heard it in the last week or two that people are still holding out hope that a Saudi deal is possible until the end of the Biden presidency. I find that very hard to believe, just in terms of the technicalities of getting it approved. on Capitol Hill, and also the politics on Capitol Hill during a transition. But it's definitely out there in the ether. The people are still kind of holding it out there as the major prize and the major carrot. I think many people here and in DC have an interest in having it still be talked about as a real option.
These are the same people that have been saying it. Of course, we would support it, but it's not just the politics in Washington. There's the politics in Riyadh and the politics in Jerusalem. This will require some Israeli commitment on a two-state solution, on a Palestinian state, which the politics in Jerusalem does not allow. Riyadh, they need something meaningful, right? It can be wordsmithing because after October 7th, the price tag has, so it's not going to work there. So in a sense, I feel like we're all engaged in this, it's the 10 people in Washington and a few more in Israel that are engaged in what we call Saudi splaining, right? Disregarding what the Saudis say, saying what they say is not really what they mean and what they feel. And to our audience, if you read or listen to Bob Woodward's latest book, chapter 53, there's really, I don't have to go through the whole thing, but there's a recollection of this whole Blinken January 2024 visit to Riyadh and then coming to Jerusalem and seeing why the stars don't align and what MBS, the Crown Prince, actually tells him. And he says, do I want this? It doesn't even matter. I need this. In Saudi, I need this for my people. I need something substantial. So
on the Palestinian
issue.
Right.
Yeah. Really fascinating.
I think that even if you are incredibly cynical about the Saudis and you discount anything they say about Palestinian statehood, and I think there are good reasons to be cynical about them, there's just a more pressing problem, which is I don't think they can do this while the fighting is still going on in Gaza. And, just yesterday, the latest Israeli airstrike killed 110 or 115 people in Gaza. And there's no way they can do this while this is still going on. And, I'm sure we're going to talk about this in a minute, or maybe we'll talk about it now, but I'm not optimistic that the fighting in Gaza is any closer to being done than it was a week ago or a month ago or a year ago. So there's a more pressing problem here. And I don't see how
these were the two demands, right? MBS said, I need the fighting to stop and I need something meaningful on the topic of Palestinian statehood. And you don't have either one.
Yeah, I think, look, I agree with you both 100%. I think the idea being floated, Shira, what did you say, 10 people in DC and a handful of people in Jerusalem? I think it's 4 people in DC and 2 people in Jerusalem. I think
I'm being generous.
Yeah, but
if we want to make this more interesting, Neri, we can name them.
No. Some of them, I don't know if they listen, but maybe their aides listen. Again, we're not personalizing it. I'm just saying that I think the idea being floated out there is this kind of grand package where you would get a Gaza deal, you would get a Lebanon deal, you would get a Saudi deal. Netanyahu, bolstered by the past month on the battlefields in the north and the south, would go for snap elections to kind of jettison Ben-Gvir and Smotrich in the far right in his current coalition. And that's how you kind of wrap it up in a bow. I think that's the idea.
We would be, no one would be a big supporter of this than I think we would, right? And this is sort of like a bigger context, but right, if we don't leverage this year of bloodshed and wreckage on all fronts to a major diplomatic initiative, this is really an opportunity loss. So it makes a lot of sense. But to remind you, I was the one who was more optimistic here when Netanyahu went to Congress, right? And it was like every time there was an opportunity, and again, this is described very well in the book, earlier this year, every time there was an opportunity to sort of make the choice in that direction, the Israeli government, Netanyahu, chose to go the other way. If something changes today, that'd be great, but it has to happen very soon because of the timeline in Washington, right? It can't be done January 10th. It takes time to ratify treaties, to vote. There are processes, and I don't know how you square the circle and get all of this done very quickly. If they can make it, they deserve the Peace Nobel Prize.
Yeah, highly ambitious, but it was ambitious back in April when this was also floated as a kind of grand prize and a carrot for Netanyahu to end the war. I'd argue, I think I made the point last week on the podcast or the week before, that Netanyahu's kind of domestic position and domestic strength has changed. And so maybe his political calculations are also changing. I mean, without further ado, let's get into it, at least in the kind of smaller bore deals, Gaza and Lebanon. In recent days, we've had these kind of flurry of meetings and reports on possible progress towards a ceasefire for hostage deal in Gaza and a deal to end the war in Lebanon. There was another summit meeting in Doha, Qatar early this week, first time in many weeks, which included Mossad chief Dedi Barnea. We also have Biden's top envoys, including Brett McGurk and Amos Hochstein, expected in Israel tomorrow, Thursday. For the record, we're recording this Wednesday evening, Tel Aviv time. I don't want to get into the details and the weeds of all of this because I think there's a lot of wishful thinking and spin going on. And more to the point, we've been down this road many, many times before with these false dawns as now 101 hostages still languish in Gaza. But I guess, Michael, let's start with you. How optimistic are you with regard to any progress on one or both of these fronts?
I mean, I hate to always be the Debbie Downer of this podcast, but I'm not hugely optimistic or optimistic in any way. I think that the situation in Gaza remains pretty intractable. I don't see any evidence that Hamas is willing to back off its demands of an end to the war and a complete Israeli withdrawal, which are just not in the cards anytime soon. And that's, by the way, assuming that we even know who speaks for Hamas. From the Israeli side, I see no evidence that Israel is willing to consider some of the things that might make this easier, such as withdrawing from the Philadelphia corridor or withdrawing from Netzarim. And, we remain with the political problem, which is that a really significant and powerful faction in this coalition doesn't want to end the fighting and also wants to resettle Gaza, right? You had not just Bezalel Smotrich, but Likud ministers just on, was it Sunday, I believe, speaking at a conference where they're talking about the need to resettle Gaza and how if you don't have civilians there, then you won't have the military and then you can't ensure Israel's security. And, so this is not a coalition that is moving quickly toward any sort of resolution in Gaza that will actually end the fighting. This is a coalition that is looking to deepen Israel's hold on Gaza. And frankly, a coalition that has not had genuine regard for the lives and welfare of the hostages from day one. And that I also see no evidence of having changed. So, I think that on the Gaza front, nothing to my mind is different. And in some ways, because there's been so much focus on Lebanon, in some ways, and you really feel it here in the United States, you guys can tell me if you feel the same in Israel, there's less focus on Gaza. It's almost now like it's a sideshow. And that certainly doesn't augur anything good for the fighting in Gaza coming to an end. So I don't see progress there. I think that maybe I'm a little more optimistic on Lebanon because there are other factors involved. And I also think that the same political incentives obviously don't apply in Lebanon as they do in Gaza. But, it's obviously still a very complicated situation. And I think that, if I'm the Israeli government, I absolutely would not want to end the fighting in Lebanon without a real enforcement mechanism in place ahead of time that I trust to keep Hezbollah off the border and to make sure that you don't just repeat what's happened since 2006. And that doesn't seem like the kind of thing that, I know there's been progress on negotiating that, but that also doesn't seem like the kind of thing that's going to just materialize overnight. Like I said, if I were the Israeli prime minister, I wouldn't agree to a ceasefire and say, we'll work out the arrangements later. I wouldn't agree unless the arrangements were worked out ahead of time and I trusted them. So I think that while that's more doable, it still seems pretty difficult to me.
I will say, just by way of anecdote, I was at a meeting at the Kiryat, the military headquarters here in Tel Aviv last night, and there was a hostage family demo outside the Kiryat. That's their kind of normal spot to demonstrate. There may have been 100, 200 people outside the Kiryat, whereas a month and a half ago you had 150,000, 200,000 people in that very same spot. So yes, sadly, Michael, the focus here has definitely shifted towards Lebanon, and Gaza seems to be kind of this grinding sideshow. Shira, what do you think with regard to the prospects of any kind of diplomatic progress? Israel obviously wants Hamas and Hezbollah and Iran to bend and soften their longstanding demands. I don't know how realistic that is right now. Netanyahu and his government presumably also have to give something in return to get these deals done. But we also know that the Israeli military, if not the defense establishment, is kind of pushing to wrap these things up, to wrap both these wars up. Where do you think things stand at the moment?
I agree with you. Israel wants certain things. They want, Hamas and Hezbollah to raise the white flag and surrender, and Iran to change completely. And, it's like I tell my children, it's okay to want things, but you just have to be, a bit more realistic. And there is, and interestingly, I think, a consensus within the defense establishment. Neri, I think it's pretty unique. It used to be that the people in Northern Command were more sort of like gung-ho, right? Wanted to keep striking and expand the war and find more targets. But there really seems to be a consensus that in terms of the military achievements, Israel has done remarkably. And we are at the risk that staying in Lebanon longer could degrade some of those achievements, expose soldiers to more risks. I mean, we're talking about is there every day we see dead soldiers from Lebanon, right? This is not cost-free. And there's a risk of being dragged into the Lebanese mud. And that's why I think it's quite rare that we see such uniform opinion among the defense establishment in terms of the need to at least end Lebanon, right? Now, before being dragged into it in more meaningful ways, Gaza is too late. We've been dragged into it. It doesn't mean we don't have to end it. But I think in Lebanon, and then this depends on Netanyahu. Hard for me to see him making any decision before the U.S. elections. And then the question would go to will we even know the result of the elections, right, in a reasonable time? But that's one thing. When we talk about Gaza, I mean, for all the reasons that Michael said, because it's also has to do with even deeper political issues, with the ideological reasons of a certain camp that wants to resell Gaza because of the hostages that, sadly, the behavior of this government does not indicate that they want them back. I don't see the same urgency. The IDF definitely wants to try to get out and find a substitute, but this is not where the political rank is. And we spoke about the hostages. Amos Harel today reported in Haaretz that every 10 days, on average, we're losing the lives of one hostage. So we are not at the numbers that Netanyahu spoke about. He spoke about 50% of the 101. We're not at those numbers. What I heard also, is not from this report that I read, is that there are 15 Ruan Arad cases where hostages that are estimated to be dead, and the people that last saw them dead or buried their bodies are also dead. How are we going to solve this? I mean, it has to be obviously with an agreement, and the IDF definitely wants that. The defense minister definitely wants this. And I think we have an indication of why this is not going anywhere positive. The deputy head of the prisoners, the hostage headquarters, ON Seter, a brigadier general, one-star general, extremely talented officer.
The negotiating team.
Yeah, the negotiating team.
Israel.
So he's the number two after, there's the head of the Mossad, Nitzan Alon, and then Oren Seter, he resigned this week. And he did not resign because he's not committed to the issue. He was there even after he left the IDF. He came back on October 7th and dedicated all his life in the past year and so, right, just to this topic. And I think it's pretty telling that if he resigns, what he thinks about the prospect of a deal. Now, I hope I'm wrong, but unfortunately, it's very hard to be optimistic here. And closing Gaza, right? The campaign in Gaza, what it means obviously there needs to be some negotiation about the hostages, with the prisoner swap, finding solutions for the IDF presence in different parts of Gaza, and this whole idea of an alternative to Hamas, right? Sort of the refusal to come up with or to agree to the only some sort of consensus day after solution that there is, there'll be some sort of transitional authority on the ground that has Palestinian Authority representation, but not only, and supported by the international community. Everyone wants it, but the government of Israel. So I'm pessimistic.
I think pessimism is the right emotion until proven otherwise. And even today, I mean, look at today's events, right? Israel, shall we say, escalated dramatically in eastern Lebanon and the Bekaa Valley, ordered the evacuation of the entire city of Baalbek, which pretty dramatic, ahead of major airstrikes. Hezbollah's new leader, Naim Qassem, new and probably temporary leader, shall we say, gave a speech and didn't really seem like he was bending Hezbollah's position. Fighting still ongoing in Jabalia, northern Gaza. Pretty serious IDF operation. And again, we're talking about the fallen IDF soldiers and reservists in southern Lebanon. It's not cost-free in northern Gaza either these days. With casualties, that operation isn't likely to end anytime soon. I think a continuation of the war is likely, with one caveat. I think, again, after the U.S. election and depending on the results, I think there may be an opening to get one or two deals, either in Lebanon or Gaza. I think there is an opening, but like we all know, it depends on the whims and mood and political calculations of one man. I'm hopeful that if not in the near term, then in the medium term, in the coming, say, 2 or 3 months, we may see some progress, but unlikely tomorrow. Okay, we'll be right back after this brief message.
For infographics, videos, threads, and more on critical issues impacting the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, Israeli politics, U.S.-Israel relations, and regional dynamics, be sure to follow us on Instagram and Twitter. You can find our pages at the links in the show notes. If you rely on Israel Policy Forum for credible and nuanced analysis, please make a gift today so that our work can continue to have an impact. Donate now at the Support the Show link in the show notes.
On to the next topic, which was the other big news of this past week. As you both know, the Knesset passed not one, but 2 laws against UNRWA, otherwise known as the UN Agency for Palestinian Refugees. The first law banned UNRWA from the sovereign territory of the State of Israel, but not to be outdone. The second law banned all Israeli officials and government bodies from any contact with UNRWA. These laws are set to go into effect in 3 months. This was a big move and a controversial move in some/many quarters, even in the context of the ongoing war, with potentially, I dare say, far-reaching consequences, not only for Gaza, but also for East Jerusalem and the West Bank. Shira, I know this is an issue you follow closely, along with our colleague Jess Manville. What are your initial thoughts about the law that the Knesset passed, or the laws that the Knesset passed 2 nights ago?
Wow, I mean, listen, we have voiced our criticism when it comes to UNRWA, right? Its role, the execution of its role, its expanded authorities, its anti-Israel bias, incitement, even anti-Semitism. This is a very problematic agency. And we also wrote a report and suggesting very serious reforms in terms of that maybe we'll get it to, how does the song go? Killing it softly. Killing it softly. That was the song, right? But this idea of going cold turkey like this, with such extreme measure, this is really the nuclear option. At such a sensitive time, I was really surprised. And I was really surprised for 2 reasons. Neri, you and I spoke about it yesterday, but at a time where Israel is fighting on multiple fronts and is trying to keep a lid on the West Bank, why would you do something that would destabilize everything? The second one is that there is a letter that Israel received, a letter of warning signed by Secretary Blinken and Secretary Austin, with very specific asks regarding the humanitarian situation in Gaza. And they're asking Israel to cancel the legislation. I also heard that Biden spoke about this and made this plea with Netanyahu on his phone call. So against U.S. requests, with real implications for Israel's arms supply, right? This is not just like a nice letter. We're just asking you if you kindly do what we ask. This has real implications, and Israel just goes ahead and passes with extreme majority this legislation without assessing its implications. Now, we are now in the process of trying to understand what constructively can be done now. But I will say, when we talk about the West Bank, I mean, despite this whole anti-UNRWA rhetoric, right, the IDF does work with UNRWA all the time, coordinates both in the West Bank and in Gaza. And when we are looking at the West Bank that has been teetering on the brink of collapse since October 7th, partially because of the economic reasons, right, where we have 120, 140, depending how you count, 1,000 Palestinian workers who can no longer work in Israel, limitations on access and movement, all the measures Israel withholding tax revenue payers, the economic situation in the West Bank is really bad. And when we're talking about in the refugee camps, we're talking about 60% unemployment. Now, what are you doing? You strip UNRWA out of this equation. So you're pulling the safety net from the number that we have is 913,000, almost 1 million beneficiaries who rely on this for social services. There are 47,000 students that will be left without schools if UNRWA decides to close its schools. And it depends on how this law is implemented, but they could very well close this. Is this what Israel needs? More unemployment, more young people with grievances and no money on the streets on the West Bank? Now, in Gaza, of course, we know that despite different attempts to scale up other agencies, nothing has been done in a serious way. So UNRWA remains the backbone of the logistical apparatus in Gaza. Now, again, when Israel is on the line, there are arrest warrants hanging by The Hague. We have this letter from the U.S. that's supposed to improve the humanitarian situation in Gaza. So you take such an extreme measure, and this also goes by the way to when I talk about East Jerusalem, right? There are issues also in East Jerusalem also, where there's in the Shafat refugee camp, UNRWA provides services that I don't see the city providing at the moment. I do hope we can find a way out of this, but with implementation starting to schedule within 90 days, it would be very difficult to do anything that can make up for the losses from UNRWA. It's such a critical time, and I don't see the UN, other agencies really making an effort to cooperate with Israel here, right? They could be like, oh, we will take on this file. This might not be the case. I hope the donor community can come to senses. And if I would be like, okay, Israel, you want an UNRWA substitute. Well, you know what? A Palestinian state could be an UNRWA substitute too. So let's try to think of what we're transferring to the Palestinian Authority. That is not easy. There's going to be a lot of resistance on the PA, but we have to turn this into something constructive because I do fear the implications.
I agree with that entirely. And of course, Israel's frustrations, if not outright hostility toward UNRWA, they're understandable and they're also justifiable, right? We've just seen plenty of evidence since October 7th about UNRWA complicity in terrorism, or UNRWA just kind of ignoring it, or oftentimes something gets reported and, and it's the Casablanca line, right? I'm, shocked to see gambling going on here, right? And that's what you get from UNRWA officials. And so I get it. I get the anger, and the IPF report that Shira and Jess co-authored, it was very clear that we don't think that the United States should restore funding to UNRWA until there are some immediate reforms carried out. And then you figure out how to really undertake deep institutional reforms and eventually wind UNRWA down. But that's not what this is. And the problem with this is that Israel now has no leverage for any of this, because I think that other governments are going to step in and they're going to fund UNRWA, and it's going to keep on operating in some way, shape, or form. And at this point, there's basically zero incentive for UNRWA to pay attention to Israeli concerns or critiques or complaints. And of course, there's the segment of the Israeli government that we've already talked about that will certainly love to collapse UNRWA entirely and say, okay, well, UNRWA can't operate now, and so it should be the IDF that operates in Gaza directly and giving out humanitarian assistance, which is something Smotrich has been calling for months, as an opening to then saying, okay, now we have to set up a whole administration for Gaza, and next thing you know, there'll be settlements, and next thing you know, Gaza is sovereign Israeli territory. So I don't think, there are some people in the government who, and the opposition, by the way, because 92 out of 120 Knesset members voted in favor. So it's actually not fair to just blame the government here, right? There are plenty of people who should know better and do know better, who voted for this just as sort of a symbolic ding against UNRWA. And then they're the people who voted for it because they really are hoping to just extend Israeli control everywhere and anywhere. So I don't see anything good coming out of this in terms of what it means for Palestinians, in terms of what it means for the burden on Israel, and in terms of what it means for Israel's ability to actually get through some sort of UNRWA reform or UNRWA replacement that isn't the IDF and the Israeli government directly. I also think that there's another angle to this, and it dovetails with another vote that happened yesterday, which is, as Shira mentioned, President Biden asked Prime Minister Netanyahu not to do this. I'm certain that when Tony Blinken was in Israel, was it last week, 2 weeks ago? I'm certain he made the same request, and it got completely ignored. Yesterday, the Knesset passed into law on the second and third readings an amendment to the basic law on Jerusalem that now prohibits any countries from opening up consulates in Jerusalem. It can only be an embassy, no consulate. And that can and should be read as a direct dig at the United States, which has been wanting to reopen its consulate in Jerusalem, notwithstanding the fact that the embassy is there and is not going anywhere. And I find it staggering and reckless and the absolute height of chutzpah by any definition, after everything that has gone on over the last 12 and a half months, after everything that the U.S. has done, all of it, the military assistance, the public warnings, the putting up with all sorts of bad Israeli behavior, ignoring pressure coming from all sorts of corners to, quote unquote, force the Israelis into a ceasefire, sending American officials for endless and fruitless negotiations to try to get the hostages out. After all of this, what is the Israeli government and the Knesset spending its time doing? It's passing bills that should be read as direct slaps in the face to the United States. And there are going to be consequences for this down the road. There absolutely will, whether they unfold quickly or whether they unfold over time. But this situation, to my mind, is not sustainable. You can't have a situation where the United States goes full out to help Israel with everything that it wants, militarily, diplomatically, in every way and everywhere. And then you basically tell the United States to screw off with legislation that you pass, and you ignore U.S. concerns on even relatively minor issues. So I think that ultimately none of what was done this week in the Knesset is going to end up benefiting Israel. And frankly, I hope that there is some sort of cost to this that deters Israeli governments from treating the United States like a dish rag in the future.
Well put. Look, I know a lot of our listeners and probably a vast majority of the Israeli public who listen to this podcast are sitting here and wondering to themselves, what's the problem? UNRWA bad. Israel just took action against UNRWA. Obviously, X number of UNRWA employees out of Gaza were involved or complicit in October 7th. We also know that UNRWA facilities inside Gaza were used by Hamas as military installations, and I don't think this should be a controversial point, although some people think it is. Just physically, that's where Hamas built tunnels and all kinds of other stuff. So I get that sentiment, and I agree with what Shira and definitely what Shira and Jess wrote, which is, the real need to reform UNRWA. My issue this week is this wasn't necessary this week. I go so far as to say it was really stupid to do this week in the midst of a war. So I think looking at the overall context and the real Israeli interest and the real understanding of how things operate and work here on the ground should have compelled, if not the Knesset, I don't have high hopes for the Knesset, but at least the very top of the Israeli government to halt this. Because the issue goes beyond Gaza, to my mind. The humanitarian aid situation in Gaza is not going to be helped by this, to say the least. But I imagine, and Shira knows this better than anyone, there are maybe workarounds to get aid into Gaza without having to deal directly with UNRWA, at least on the Israeli side. But the real issue is like Shira said, the East Jerusalem and the West Bank. And in the middle of fighting a war in Gaza and a war in Lebanon and hitting Iran and a bunch of other places in the Middle East, you're setting up the West Bank for an explosion. And it's not me saying this, it's Israeli military and security professionals saying this for years, who, whenever the debate over UNRWA came up, and it's come up, this isn't a new issue, didn't start on October 7th or October 8th, the kind of biggest but quietest defenders of maintaining funding for UNRWA was the Israeli defense establishment, because they understand how things operate in the West Bank. In the West Bank, there are 4 different quote-unquote governments. There's the Israeli government, there's the IDF, there's the Palestinian Authority, and there's UNRWA. And I mean, I can't read these laws as anything other than really just UNRWA will be forced to halt its operations in Israel, in the West Bank, and potentially in Gaza. Nothing more, nothing less. Like you said, Shira, nuclear option. So the impact on the ground could be severe. You could be kind of setting yourself up to fight on yet another front. And like you both said, the diplomatic context within which all of this is operating and occurring. To pick another massive fight with not only Washington, but pretty much everyone else in the middle of all of this. It's really stupid. Really stupid. So stupid, I should say, I may be calling myself out here, that I was kind of telling my editors, no, don't worry, they'll never pass it. This is what I was telling them as, that morning and that afternoon this week. I was obviously proven wrong because the Israeli Knesset, endless capacity to surprise us. Rant over. Before we finish, we have to get to the real topic on everyone's minds, the U.S. election next week. We touched on it earlier, but we have to kind of get into it in a more substantial way. Let's give our listeners a little bit of a preview. Don't worry. I'm not going to ask you both for, expected voting patterns in the suburbs of Philadelphia. That's not what we do here on this podcast, but I do want to make it relevant. Shira, you live here in Israel as I do. I don't think it's an understatement to say that, the vast majority of the Israeli public, and not just on the right, is very much pulling for Donald Trump. They see him, as was mentioned earlier, kind of almost unconditionally supportive of Israel, although, as Michael said, that a lot of questions should be raised on that issue. And the majority of the Israeli public views President Biden, Kamala Harris, and the Democrats as being, ranging from less supportive to downright hostile. I personally think this is a major misreading and misunderstanding of U.S. politics and current U.S. foreign policy. But how do you see the U.S. election from where you sit here in Israel?
I mean, I think you're right that if Israel was the, 51 state, right, the 51st state, it would be the reddest state. The support for Trump here is overwhelming because of how he's perceived as pro-Israel. And I think the wrong perception of Kamala Harris as being anti-Israel, or not so anti, but definitely not as pro-Israel as Trump. It's not a secret that Prime Minister Netanyahu, his money is on this horse. He showed his preference in many ways. Part of it was, what was it, Michael? Treating the U.S. administration as a dish rag. So doing this at such a sensitive time.
That's what I said. Dish rag, doormat, we can use whatever term we want.
Right. But also remember when Netanyahu was his visit to Congress, and then he went to Florida, to Mar-a-Lago to meet with Trump, and then he said something, and he knew everyone was hearing, right? Now the fun part of the visit starts, or something like that. Now the enjoyable part starts. It's very clear that he has a preference. It's remarkable that someone that was a president for 4 years is still an enigma, right? He could be very unpredictable. So it's hard for me to say what will happen if Trump wins. Looking at different statements, looking at the Republican Party platform, talking about isolationism. Some people in the Democratic Party that speak about, well, we do love Israel, but we need to focus on our priorities. So it's better if our friends are less high maintenance. I think that, Israel's going to miss the Biden administration. No question about that. But it depends, right? I don't even know that we will know the result of the elections anytime soon. And it matters here because it will affect decision-making of Netanyahu. If and when he decides to end these wars will be determined by the result of the elections. So we should probably speak again next week.
But you just said that next week we won't know.
No, I mean, maybe. We don't know if we will know, right? It's sort of the known unknowns and the known, then unknown unknowns. I mean. Yeah.
Michael, you're in D.C., so about those Philadelphia suburbs. No, I'm kidding once again.
They're going to vote. They're going to vote for Jill Stein, right? That's what I'm told.
God help us. But the same question to you, Trump versus Harris on the Israel question.
There's no question that when Trump was president, he was supportive of Israel in a whole bunch of ways, and in ways that particularly resonated with Israelis, right? Which is not the only reason, but one of the reasons why. You look at polls of Israelis, and it's something like 60%, 70% of them say that they would vote for Trump if they were voting in the U.S. election. There's also no question that the Biden administration, which includes Kamala Harris, has been more supportive of Israel in its greatest time of need than any administration in history. And I'm also quite comfortable in saying that had Donald Trump been president on October 7th, I don't think Israel would have gotten quite the same level of support in all areas and in all facets and across the board as it has from this administration. If I were the Israelis. I would have some concerns about both on different fronts. I think that despite having been president, Donald Trump is just wildly unpredictable. He's hugely transactional. I still find it mystifying why people think that he behaves a certain way in every single situation, but somehow will behave differently when it comes to Israel. And I think that Kamala Harris has expressed concerns about Israeli behavior in Gaza and certainly about Israelis' reluctance, if not outright refusal, to consider any sort of Palestinian sovereignty in the West Bank and in the West Bank and Gaza when this war is done and it's time to figure out what happens next. So there are going to be points of tension between Israel and whoever the next president is. And I think that it just depends on where you're looking, and it depends on what you prioritize. But I also think that there are many Israeli officials who will tell you that, sure, there are some things that they'll get from Trump that they won't get from Harris, and maybe there are some things they'd get from Harris they wouldn't get from Trump, but that ultimately it doesn't really matter because the U.S.'s relationship is completely safe and immune to big swings. And that's been true in the past. And I think that the U.S. is changing in important ways in this regard. Again, it's over different issues, but nobody should be discounting the way in which the right wing in the United States, and really the right wing that makes up Trump's base. And again, I'll refer back to J.D. Vance's interview earlier this week. Nobody should underestimate the ways in which they are deeply isolationist and deeply America first, and they don't view Israel as being an exception or a carve-out to this. And on the left, we've all seen college campuses and major cities in the United States post-October 7th, and this idea that you now see increasingly, not just on college campuses, but in the media and in plenty of other places, questioning Israel's very legitimacy and right to exist because of the way in which Israel came into existence. And it's been accelerated by what's happened in Gaza, but it's not been caused by what happened in Gaza, as evidenced by protests on October 8th, before Israel had done anything, already accusing Israel of genocide. So I think that on the right and on the left, things are changing. And it just means that Israel has to be more careful going forward, because in really important ways over the last year, it has done things that are pissing off the core of the right and things that are pissing off the core of the left. And this assumption that U.S.-Israel ties are unshakable and unbreakable no matter what happens, I think there are lots of historical and political science reasons why that has been the case in the past, having nothing, by the way, to do with the so-called Israel lobby. But some of that stuff is starting to change. And I just hope that Israeli leaders, right, left, and center, are paying more than surface attention to what goes on here and not just thinking about things in terms of the election on Tuesday and Trump and Harris.
I'll venture to say that Israeli leaders and the Israeli public are doing none of that. They see this as, well, not all of them. The smarter ones don't, but they see this election as kind of this Manichaean black or white choice between unconditional Trump and, the Democratic candidate, whether before it was Biden, now it's Harris, that, keeps bothering them with certain requests. And the Israeli public and the political class here have the memory of a goldfish. Because a year ago, almost exactly, after October 7th, Biden and, by extension, Harris and the Democratic Party were there not only in lockstep, they were literally embraced Israel at its gravest and direst hour of need, and have been largely supportive over the course of now over a year of war, including, by the way, this past weekend, both on offense and on defense. Against Iran. So I personally find it very frustrating, and I get messages every day from Israeli contacts and friends and family, kind of, very much showing what their opinion is with regard to next week's election. And I try to kind of push back, and it's quite frustrating. This is opinion here. The good thing is that Israelis are not the 51st state. There's no electoral college that extends to the Eastern Mediterranean. So we'll leave it to the American voting public to decide. And I will venture one prediction. I won't ask you both, for your predictions. I don't think anybody really knows what's going to happen next week. But I will venture one prediction regardless of the outcome. Whoever comes into office in late January will push for an end to these wars. So I think these wars will be concluded early next year. That's my prediction.
I agree with you. Whoever wins is going to push to end the wars. I guess where I differ is I'm not as confident that it means the wars will be ended.
Do you really expect even Bibi Netanyahu to kind of spurn, even a President Harris, but definitely a President Trump, if they come in and say, look, we want you to wrap this up nowish?
Honestly, there's nothing at this point from Bibi Netanyahu that would surprise me, or that I would ever say, he cannot happen, or that he won't do.
Okay. I mean, that's a fair venture, but I'm hoping that this is the case. I don't know that for a fact. We'll have to wait and see. Shira, parting thoughts?
I mean, I think that the timeline that you suggest makes sense. There's also, I think Netanyahu is really concerned with the economic situation here, what the country is experiencing. Such an economic crisis, right, with the credit score being downgraded 3 times, 3 levels, and with expectations for another one. No investments. We are under siege, effectively, right? There are no flights out of here, really. It's very difficult for anyone to come in, go out, and this is an export-led economy, a tech sector that's really important. We're talking about brain drain, and there's a lot of pressure also from soldiers and from reservists. So I do think that for reasons that may not have to do with sort of the diplomatic situation, but more internal socioeconomic issues in Israel, I think this timeline makes sense, that this has to end in the next 2 to 3 months, but who knows?
That's a good point too, that it's not just the identity of the US president, it's also just the reality of now over a year of war. No matter what people think, I don't even think Bibi Netanyahu thinks he can go on like this for another year, no matter what people may say, no matter what he's trying to project in the ongoing negotiations on multiple fronts. With that, we'll end there. Michael, Shira, hopefully we'll all be a lot smarter after next Tuesday, hopefully, whatever happens. I look forward to getting your thoughts about the meaning and implications of President X on these and many other issues. So thank you as always.
Thanks, guys.
Thank you.
Thanks again to Michael Koplow and Shira Efron as always. Also, a special thanks to our producer, Jacob Gilman, and to all of you who support Israel Policy Forum's work. Do consider making a donation to Israel Policy Forum so it can keep being a credible source of analysis and ideas on issues such as these that we all care deeply about, including this podcast. And most importantly, thank you for listening, and good luck next week, America.